It's November 3rd, 2014. I'm Sue Cohen, Brenda Kyle, Diana Baker, and Ellie Stewart of the San Marcos Heritage Association Oral History Committee, and today we have the pleasure of visiting with Miss Nova Festervan. And she's going to tell us a little bit about where you were born and where you grew up and your family.
Well, I was born in Coryell County. That's on Highway 36, the other side of Temple, Texas. And Gatesville is the county seat. And I grew up near a little community named Flat, where my papa was the postmaster. And we grew up on a farm. And I'm the youngest member of a large family. My parents were both married and had families, lost their first companions in death, and married each other and had our family. When they married, between them, they had 7 deceased children. They had 7 surviving children, and then they had 7 of us. So my mother was the mother of 12 children, and I'm her baby.
Wow.
And my father was sort of the go-to man in our community. Everybody looked to our papa for, I guess, support and advice, and he was on the board of trustees at the school and that sort of thing, and he was a member of the Masonic Lodge, to which he was very faithful. When I was a very young child, there was a church just a stone's throw from our house, and it was the Pleasant Ridge Baptist Church. And our house sat on a little ridge above that church, so our home place was always known as Pleasant Ridge, or the Ridge.
And what was your maiden name?
My maiden name was Clausen. I was born in 1931, and I remember my father died when I was 11 years old, and immediately after our father died, well, of course, World War II had already started, and immediately after his death, my older brothers went to the service, and I remember when everybody came home from the service, well, most everybody had married during the war years, and one day Mama was at the grocery store. Everybody had just come home, until they could find new settlement. And one day Mama was at the grocery store, and somebody asked her, "Josie, how in the world do you keep up with everybody who's living at the Ridge now?" And she said, "Well, there's very little difference in now and when they were children. The only difference is when I call them now, they come out in pairs." So we've always had a good time as a family. And when I was 16 years old, I came to San Marcos to go to college. And I was...
What year was that?
It was 1947.
Wow.
And at that time...
What was the name of the college at that time?
Southwest Texas State Teachers College. And I lived at Pickard Hall, which was a co-op house. Do you know what a co-op house is?
No.
Well, we were each assigned a room and roommates. There were 4 girls who were in my room, and we had 1 bathroom for the 4 of us. And we had a house mother, and we shared the food preparation and house cleaning responsibilities. Our house mother was named Miss Esslinger. She was a dear lady. And in those years, when we left the house, we had to sign out and write down when our expected time of return would be. And
Even during the daytime?
Yes, ma'am. And if we were to leave a campus, we had to have our parents' written permission identifying the persons we were allowed to leave campus with. Well, when I say campus, that's not exactly right. If we were going out of town, like we had friends in Austin, so Mama registered their names with my house mother. We had a curfew, lights out at 10:30, and Miss Mary Brogdon was the dean of women, and she could see the light in our room from her house. And every once in a while she'd call over there and tell me, Ceci, it's lights out, and I see some lights still on, and Miss Ceci come and knock on our door and tell us lights out.
What is there now on the university campus where the Pickford house was that you lived?
I've tried to pick it out. I can't. But the campus was so small in those years.
How many girls lived in the house?
I think there were about 25 of us. It was a big 2-story house, but it was a very comfortable house. We all took our meals together. I don't know how I managed to get on the Monday crew, but I remember the first Monday I was there, I guess I hadn't gotten my cooking assignment. I don't know. Anyway, an upperclassman came and knocked on my door and said, well, where are you? You're on breakfast duty this morning. So, but anyway, and I remember if we burned something on the stove and the pan was burned, we had to, whoever was responsible for that burning that pan had to take it out in the backyard and scrub it until it shone like new.
Wow.
But my monthly fee was $27.50. But it was lots of fun.
How many students were at the university roughly when you started?
I've been intending to phone the library and ask them, but I imagine there are about 1,500 probably.
And what
Maybe
was your
more.
major?
It was like a big high school.
Right. What was your major?
Well, I thought I would major in speech and journalism, but I didn't graduate college.
Oh.
No, I married when I had finished my sophomore year, and that finished my education, don't you know?
And where did you meet your husband, and where was he from?
Well, my husband's family owned a little motel located where Clear Springs Apartments, across the river from Saltgrass, which is now going to be a park, isn't it?
It was just torn down,
space.
yes.
Mm-hmm. They owned a little motel there, and my brother-in-law and Ben were on the same softball team together. So my brother-in-law was very anxious for me to meet Ben, and I did. And let's see, I met him in June of one year, and we married in April the next year. I met him in June of 48, and we married in April of 49.
So you were 18?
Yes, and we had to wait until I was 18 in January because my mother was disappointed that I wanted to be married at such an early age, you know, and not complete my college education. So Ben wouldn't ask for her permission until because he said he thought it would be too hard for her. So when he went to ask for my hand in marriage, my mother told him, Ben, I think as much of you as any young man Nova would choose, but she said, Nova is too young to be married. She said, I married when I was 17, and I had a family right away, and I don't want to see Nova be obligated with children at the young age that I was. So Ben and I had been married about 9 years or 10 years, and I told him, I said, if we don't have children pretty soon, I'm going to take you back up there and let Mama give you another good talking to. But thankfully, when we'd been married a little over 10 years, our family doctor, Dr. Scheib, phoned me at the bank and said, have you and Ben ever thought about adopting a child? And I said, well, we've talked about it, but not seriously. And he said, well, I wonder if you could come over to my office. And I said, when? And he said, well, right now. So that was on Tuesday morning, and I phoned Ben, and we went over to Dr. Scheib's office. And on Friday morning, we brought home this beautiful baby girl. Now, how about that for miracles?
That's a wonderful story. That's great.
Ben and I had been married about a year, I guess, when Mr. Robert Nance, who was executive VP at the First National Bank, just said to Ben, do you think your wife would like to go to work? And he said, well, I don't know. And he said, well, you tell her if she wants a job to come to see me. So I went to see him, and I got a job. And I worked at the bank 46 and a half years.
Wow. And you started doing, what was your first position at the bank?
Well, I started as a proof clerk. And what a proof clerk did, they received the work that the tellers had taken in, the deposits, and proved it for accuracy, you know. And then, and let's see, my next job was as a bookkeeper, where we posted our customers' accounts.
You did that manually? Was that
No, we had a big old Burroughs posting machine. You'd put those ledgers in that machine and punch a button, and it would just rock you back and forth. It was, I guess it'd be a museum piece now.
Wow.
And then after that, I was a teller. And after that, well, Mr. Bob Pollard had come to be our executive vice president. I think I worked for Mr. Nance about a year, and then Mr. Pollard came to the bank. And from the teller line, I moved to be his secretary and secretary to other officers in the bank as well. And I don't remember in what year I was elected an officer of the bank, but then after I was Mr. Pollard's secretary or bank stenographer, I went to supervise the bookkeeping department. And then I don't remember what year I was elected cashier of the bank, and then later assistant vice president. And the highest office I held in the bank was executive vice president.
Roughly what year were you assistant vice president? Like in the 60s?
Probably.
And that was unusual for women to work their way up?
Well, it was.
At that point in time.
It was. And I felt very fortunate to work for men who saw a need for women in places of leadership. And I know there are other women in our community who were just as capable as I was, but they didn't get the same opportunity that I did.
You were a pioneer locally in the banking business, I would say.
Well, maybe so. Maybe so.
And one of the first to rise to that position in town.
I remember that I was the first woman to be elected to a board of directors of a financial institution in San Marcos.
Wow. So 46 years at First National Bank. Where was the bank located, and how many different names did it have over the years? And what's it called now in 2014?
Well, when I went to work at the bank, we were located on the corner of East San Antonio and North LBJ, which became the Hays County Annex.
What year did you actually go to work at the bank?
I went to work in 1950, and that was the First National Bank. Remained the First National Bank until 1990, when we had the unhappy experience of going through the bank failure. And we were acquired by Victoria Bank and Trust, who was then acquired by Norwest, and then Norwest acquired Wells Fargo, but they took the Wells Fargo name because of name recognition. What year did we move to the new building? 1975, I believe. Is that right, Ellie?
I think so, yes.
Yes.
it was a happy experience for us to build that new building. When I went to work at the bank, the Harper family owned the bank, and they retained ownership until 1981, when Mr. Carroll Sullivan, who was chairman of Central Texas Bank Shares, bought the bank. My first memory of the board of directors of the First National Bank, of course, Mr. Harper was president. Mr. Henry Kyle, who was our family's attorney, was on the board. Mr. Robert Nance, Mr. Millard Fleming, Mr. Hugh Williamson. I can't remember everybody.
Was Mr. Shewitz?
Yes,
Yeah.
Mr. Max Shewitz from Euland was on the
Wow.
board.
It's a pretty good memory.
And the businesses around the square. When I first came to San Marcos, there was a Chinese market at the corner of West San Antonio, and it was North Austin Street then.
What do you mean
Yeah.
Chinese market?
Well, I wish I could remember.
I've never
the-
heard they sold Chinese
I-
groceries.
Well, they just sold everything.
I never heard of that ever.
I wish I could remember the name of that market.
What year was
It
that?
was
19.
What's there now?
Larry Murphy's building
Oh.
with law offices, but
Chinese market.
after the Chinese, well, really Chinese market's not an apt description of it. It wasn't exactly a department store. It was just kind of an everything store, you know. And I wish I could remember the name of it, but I can't. And then San Marcos Department Store occupied that location. And then in that block there was a jewelry store, and of course the theater. And the door this side of the theater was Papa's Cafe. The Papa's family, Mr. and Mrs. Papas, were Greek immigrants, and they ran the restaurant and lived upstairs with their family. Joanne and Mike and Jimmy, and there was an older boy named Tommy. So we frequented Papa's Cafe regularly.
For lunch.
Well, the bank bunch would always go there for a coffee break,
Ah.
and they made the best cupcakes in the world. They weren't very sweet, just right for a mid-morning snack, you know. So
It's been 60 years, and everybody we interview talks about Papa's Cafe. It must have been good.
well, the Papa's Cafe was an institution in San Marcos, and the Papa's family were dear people. My husband's business was Hill Auto Supply, which is now Nephew's.
Ah.
And one day, Mr. Papa said to Ben, "Why don't you let me build you a new building?" And so they talked about it, and Mr. Pappas built the building on West San Antonio Street, which most recently was Napolito's.
Yes.
There been, and Ben moved. Ben's store was Hill Auto Supply Store, so he moved the store down there. And Mr. Pappas was a great man. Ben used to say that he was the greatest American he'd ever known. Mr. Pappas had a wonderful story that he told us. Of course, they were Greek Orthodox, and when Mr. Pappas was still a bachelor, he lived in Arizona, and he was in partnership with another man in a little confectionery. And the confectionery wasn't doing very well, and so Mr. Pappas said to his partner, he said, "Well, you have a family, and I'm single, and I'll just get out and find something else for me to do, and I think maybe you can make a living out of this place. And about that time, some folks came by and invited Mr. Pappas and his partner to go to church. And his partner said to Mr. Pappas, whose name was Bill, he said, "Oh, Bill, you go ahead and go to church, and I'll stay here and tend to the shop." So Mr. Pappas went to the church, and it was a Baptist church. And, of course, the service was absolutely strange to Mr. Pappas. But when they started to take up the offering, and Mr. Pappas saw everybody putting money into that plate, he said he just didn't know what he was going to do, because all the money he had was a $10 bill. And he said, "I just felt like I couldn't put all of my money in that offering plate, but still I was embarrassed to let it go by without putting something in." So he put his $10 in the offering. And the minister made an announcement that they had a very generous visitor attending that morning, and identified Mr. Pappas. And he said, Mr. Pappas said, "From that day forward, we could not make enough sandwiches and ice cream." He said that was the best business investment I ever made.
Oh, that's great. So he built the building for your husband, Ben. Was he an investor, or did he just do that because they were friends, or how did that transpire?
Well, I'm sure he was motivated by friendship, but he had an eye for profit too.
Mm-hmm.
He was their home was where the Tantra coffee shop is now.
Ah.
And several years after Mr. Pappas died, the IRS audited our return, and they wanted to see Ben's lease agreement. And Ben said, I don't have a lease agreement. He said, "It's a handshake agreement." And the IRS agent said, "Oh, you can't do that. You have to be able to prove that you lease this building." And Ben said, "Well, all I can suggest is that we go to see my landlady." And so Mr. Pappas' daughter, Joanne, had inherited the building. And so the IRS agent and Ben went over to knocked on Joanne's front door, and she came and verified to the man's satisfaction that she was indeed the owner of the building, and that
Wow.
Ben paid her money every month. So,
How long did he have his auto parts business? Roughly.
21, 22, about 22 years.
Where did y'all live during that, when you first married in San Marcos?
Well, when we first married, we lived at the motel.
Ah.
We lived right there on the river and played in the river every day. And, of course, Ben fished in the river, and for a long time he held the record for having caught the largest bass in the San Marcos River. And my father-in-law was, I called him the original river beautifier. Mr. Festervan had a big, I called it a drag line, but it wasn't a drag line, but it was a tractor with some kind of an attachment on it that he could reach. He'd park the tractor on one side of the river, and he could reach to the other side of the river with that hook of sorts. And he would pull the water hyacinths out of the river, load them in a dump truck, and take them someplace. You know, if there's any moisture anywhere, water hyacinths can grow in it. So he'd load the dump truck with those water hyacinths and take them to an arid spot, and to try to keep the river clean. I imagine he got some wild rice and other desirable things, but he sure kept the river sparkling.
He was ahead of his time.
Yes, and of course that was before Ocarina was developed. And
The motel catered to people going to the college or tourists or?
Both. And before I knew the Festervan family, they catered to Gary Air Force Base when it was first opened. Those couples lived there, and of course they always had a lot of permanent guests, but they had tourist guests too.
How many rooms did they have, roughly?
I want to say there were 14, and that motel was built by a family named Vogelsang, and the cottages were named like Bluebird's Nest and Wren's Nest, and each
What was
one.
the name of the motel?
It was built as Vogelsang Lodges,
Uh-huh.
which is birdsong, and then it was Festervan Lodges, and then it was Clear Spring Lodges, and then the Festervans sold it and financed it themselves, and then they had to take it back, and I can't remember how long they had it that time, and then Mr. John Stokes bought it and built
the
Clear Spring
apartments.
Apartments.
Where'd y'all move after the motel?
Well, the Festervans bought a house out on the Blanco River. First house after you cross the Blanco, first house on the right, a big 2-story house. They bought that house from Mr. and Ms. Robert Lorenz, and let's see, how long did we live there? I know they sold the motel in 1952.
So you lived with your in-laws there?
Yes. There was another little house on the property. We all lived in the big house at first, and then Ben and I moved to the little house that was on the property. And then Ben and I bought a house at 606 Barbara Drive, where we were living when Lee came to live with us. And Mr. and Ms. Festervan built a house on the Wimberley Highway, and then they sold that big 2-story house to Coach Jowers and his wife Irma Alice.
So your daughter went to elementary, junior, and high school all through the San Marcos Public Schools?
Yes, she did.
Well, back to the motel, the Festervan Lodges. Did it ever flood or?
No, the cottages were up on
Cottages.
stilts. The cars, people parked their cars under the cottages. But I saw my father-in-law stay up all night, many a night. When the river was on the rise, he'd stay up and watch the water, because if a flood was imminent, all the playground equipment had to be moved. And I really don't remember. I don't believe we ever had really an overflow in the 3 years that I lived there. But Mr. Festervan could look at the debris that was in the river, and he could sort of measure the threat, because he said when he saw debris from Sink Springs come down the river, he knew not to go to bed.
Knew that it was coming.
Mm-hmm.
Now, directly across from y'all was the old ice house?
Yes. And I believe the ice house was still there when we moved away in 1952.
It was operating as an ice house?
Yes,
still?
it was, yes. You know, we'd go over there and buy 50-pound blocks of ice and make homemade ice cream. And of course, the ice house, they sent trucks out on delivery in those years. Isn't that strange to think
A lot of
about?
people, a lot of the old houses have the doors where the ice was delivered, the ice delivery door.
Mm-hmm.
Things have changed in all these years. Well, back to the bank, I guess you saw many, many changes over the years in the equipment you used in the bank, the modernization of the bank, and
Yes, indeed. there were lots of changes.
I mean, when you started working there, they hadn't even heard of a computer or.
No, the first summer I worked there, we didn't have air conditioning. We had floor fans, and we used paperweights. We'd have a stack of checks in front of us to post, and we'd have to keep a paperweight on those checks to keep the air from the fan blowing them asunder.
And your equipment was a 10-key calculator?
Yes.
And typewriters, I guess.
Yes, we had typewriters. And that brings to mind another story I'd like to share with you. When I was a teller, Mr. Byron Thomas, nicknamed Badger, although his sisters really didn't like that nickname, but Mr. Byron Thomas was responsible for the operations part of the bank, and I would do his letters. And the first thing Mr. Thomas required us to do was to use both sides of the adding machine paper. He was very frugal, not with his friends, because he was generous to all of us, but with himself and his business associations, he was very frugal. So we used both sides of the adding machine tape. And I see now there's nothing wrong with that. We sort of complained about it in those years, but now I think it's kind of a good idea.
So you ran a whole tape and then you loaded it back up, rolled it up, and put it back in?
We wouldn't
on the
run a
other
whole
side?
tape. We'd just roll off when we got enough rolled off that we thought it was worthwhile to change, we just tear that off and reverse it and run it back through our machine. And I typed all of his correspondence for him, and he told me, he said, now when I receive a letter, I want you to turn that letter over, put your carbon down, put our letterhead on it, and send my reply typed on the reverse of that letter. And now look how efficient that was. See, I just had one letter to file, and if he wanted to know how he had responded to anybody, all I had to do was get that one letter out, and he
That's
had
pretty
his
smart,
one
actually.
That smart, yeah. And I remember once.
That's before copy machines, so you made your copy right onto the original.
Yes, and of course we used more carbon, but we'd upend that carbon, and we used every bit of carbon that was on each sheet, I'll tell you. I remember one time he wrote to Homer Thornberry, who was our congressman at the time, said, "Dear Homer, I have just paid my income tax. It's no longer taxation, it's confiscation. Yours truly, Byron Thomas."
Great. That's great.
Some of the other interesting people know at the bank, like Tula Wyatt and Gertrude Williamson and all the Thomas family. There were some
Oh yes,
people
they
I wish
were.
we'd gotten to
Tula
interview.
Wyatt worked at the bank?
No, but she was a faithful customer, and she used to love to come and visit.
Yes, she did, and she was
was,
always a joy to have,
Yeah.
because she had so many interesting things to talk about.
She and I wrote that history of the First National Bank. Do you remember?
Yes.
She wrote it. I typed it. I typed what she told me to type. I'm not sure the whole thing was totally accurate, but
Well, history is sort of in the telling, isn't it?
it is, yeah.
That's right.
And she did a lot to help us prepare when we got a historical marker for the bank. She did, and of course the opening of the new building, dedication of the new building, and all of that.
Tell me about the clock, that hangs in the new bank. And did y'all put a time capsule in the new bank?
Yes, there was a new, there was a time capsule of the new bank, but Ellie, is it buried beneath the historical marker, or?
I think it is.
I
Pretty sure.
and I
that's
can't
what it was.
remember when it was supposed to be opened.
We
But the
better check
Blair
on it.
clock originated at, you remember, or maybe you're not old enough to
I
remember,
don't think so.
how a lot of banks on when they were located on the corner, they'd have a clock on
Mhm.
that corner. So our chairman of the board, Mr. Albie Blair, bought a clock and had it installed on the corner of the old bank building. And I was working at the building, at the bank, when that happened, but I don't remember what year it was. But anyway, when we drew the plans for the new building, and the plan had already been finalized, and then the question came up, what are we going to do with that clock? And we talked about it, and we understood that there was a lot of strong sentimental feeling about that clock.
It was really black.
Yeah, yes, it was. Well, it was kind of bronze, you know,
Yeah.
kind of, and weathered. And so I remember Bruce Harper asking the interior designer, Rod Bond, said, well, what kind of a budget would it take to have that clock refurbished? And they talked about it a little bit and decided how they would want it to look, you know, how we would want it to look, which included the stained glass that's in it now. And Rod came up with a budget of about $10,000. So Bruce told him, well, let's go ahead and redesign the clock so that we can hang it in the lobby. And then he told us the roof will have to be redesigned.
Oh, for the clock.
To support the weight of the clock. So they did that, and I'm glad they did.
It's a focal point of the bank, the focal point.
Yes.
I think so.
Now, when you worked down on the square, when the bank was in the old location, that was a hub of activity. The courthouse was the county seat, and there were grocery stores. Tell us more about working down on the square and life down there at that time.
Well, as you say, that was the center of commercial activity.
Uh-huh.
Of course, the Ford dealership was on the south side of the square at the corner of Guadalupe and San Antonio Street. And King Feed Company was across the street from that, and then across Guadalupe Street. Then across West San Antonio from King Feed Store would be Hill Auto Supply, and then there was a grocery store. I think Willie Hicks' parents had a grocery store.
I've heard there were
somewhere
several
on the west
grocery
side,
stores over
and
there.
the Dement family had a grocery store. Kroll Marnie Pharmacy was there, and earlier, where the county records building is, that's now empty, there was a Bass Drug Store there. And then, of course, the old State Bank was across the Hopkins Street.
Mm-hmm.
And when you crossed Guadalupe Street from the State Bank, there Duke and Ayers was there. And a long time ago, dentist's office used to be upstairs over drugstores.
Mm-hmm.
I remember there was a Dr. McGoy upstairs in, I can't remember which building it was, but there was a dress shop on the north side of the square. Sarur's had a clothing store on the north side of the square. A drugstore, Hilburn's drugstore was there, and then Harrison's dress shop.
Woods Jewelry? Is that
Yes, Woods Jewelry was right next to Duke and Ayers,
Mhm.
wasn't it? And on the corner, well, that Wood Brothers had a men's shop too. Harrison's had a ladies' dress shop, and then Wood Brothers had a men's shop. And then there were two ladies' shops after that. One was owned by Amy Lou and Billy Bass, and then the one closer to North Austin Street, which is now LBJ, was Mrs. Sarur. And then across Austin Street, now LBJ, J.C. Penney's Well, in my earliest memory, Slider Furniture Store was there. And then north of the furniture store was the old location for the Pennington Funeral Home.
Right.
Then as we come around the square from Slider, J.C. Penney's, I think the Ragsdales had a grocery store in the building, which is
Did Norman Jackson have one somewhere?
Ragsdale's had one on one corner, and Jackson's had one on one corner.
Well, the Weatherford family had one down
Little off the square.
off the square.
I don't remember the Weatherford family's grocery store. But then coming
Because people
south,
came to town to do all their business at once. They went to
Absolutely.
the bank, went to the post office, they went to the store, all right there on the
Mhm.
square.
Yes.
Everything.
yes, and of course above the bank was the law office. You know,
Right.
Mr. Kyle's law office, Kyle and Walker, and there were other law offices around the square as well.
And the
You know.
courthouse was a
It
active
was
court hub.
it was the humming place.
Uh-huh.
Every county office was there, even including the sheriff's office.
Wow.
I remember one time when we were still in the old location, the old bank location, we got a telephone call that said, well, you need to be on the alert because something's going to happen at the bank today, and it's going to be a Bonnie and Clyde operation. So, you know, it kind of put us on alert. So I phoned over to the sheriff's office and told them that we had, Bub Meeks answered the phone. Bub Meeks was an old-time deputy sheriff. And I told him what had happened, and he said, well, if you need any help, you call us. I thought, Bub, I'm calling you right now.
But they never came.
They never
Bonnie
came,
and Clyde
thankfully.
never showed up.
Thankfully.
So you never got robbed while you worked at the bank.
We never did.
That's pretty amazing in 46 years.
Mhm. It is.
Because there's been a lot of banks around here that have been robbed.
Yes.
They were afraid to mess with you, Nova.
Is that what it was?
Where was the post office, where was it when you first moved here, Nova?
The post office was on North Austin Street, where the main bank of Frost Bank is now.
And it was a pretty old building.
Beautiful
Yeah.
building.
They tore it down
Beautiful.
to build the Frost Bank.
Well, it was State Bank and Trust then.
Right.
Yeah.
That was in the 60s or early 70s?
I think it was earlier than that, but I'm not sure. I used to have postcards of the old post office building. Have you ever seen pictures of it? Oh, you would be sorry that
Really?
it's not still here if you could see those pictures, because it probably was the most beautiful building in town.
And they just decided they needed a new post office?
I suppose so, although I wouldn't.
Isn't that a shame?
Well, you know, there was a time when we wanted to modernize everything. Even in, let's see, I guess it was in the early 60s, we decided we'd put that aluminum skin on the bank building, you know.
Yeah.
And years later, Mr. Pollard lamented to me, why did I ever decide to do that, he said.
Seemed like the right thing at the time.
Well, that's what I told him. I said,
was.
well, just be glad that we just covered it up in place of tearing it down.
Right.
Because the restoration did make a real neat thing.
Yeah, very much. So you've been a longtime member of the Baptist Church here.
Well, yes, when I came to college, I united with the First Baptist Church. And then after we moved out on the east end of town, the church had a mission church named Calvary Baptist.
Mhm.
So we moved our membership there, and I worshiped there for 50 years. And then in, I think it was 2001, I moved my membership back to the First Baptist Church, because Lee was worshiping at the First Baptist Church, and I wanted to worship with her. And I had got to where I couldn't drive at night, and
Uh-huh.
so
Oh. What did you do for fun here in San Marcos? All social activities.
well, when I started going with Ben, when I started dating Ben, I went to lots of softball games. And then we went to, we went to the college ball games, and went to the movies.
Were they having like dances on the top of the Alcarina Hotel? at
No,
that
they had already
time?
stopped
doing
that. Uh-huh.
I think that's so neat.
And then, of course, after Ocarina was developed, when we'd have guests, that was a
Right.
favorite place to go. We'd go to San Antonio, and the time was when we just drive to Austin to have supper.
Right.
You know, when that drive was simple, and it was fun to just to just go and have dinner.
Right.
This is, what was it like in San Marcos when World War II?
And the schools, what about the schools? Were you happy when Lee was in the San Marcos schools? Or how did-
Well, mostly, yes.
Mostly.
Sometimes her behavior would bring caution.
I was talking more about the quality of education.
Well, I did worry because she was never required to make book reports or memorize poetry. But
You'd really be worried now. They don't even have books. Now, you were living here when World War II ended. You had just come to college here when World War II ended?
Well,
in 46?
Well, I came in 47, and the war ended in 45. I came to school, I came to college when veterans were entering college.
So that had an impact. Gary Job Corps was downsizing and the veterans
Well,
were coming back to
it
school.
wasn't Job Corps at that time.
Gary Air Force Base, I'm
Yes.
sorry, yes.
Well, it had closed by the time I came to San Marcos, and they had taken the barracks at Gary and made them into student housing, and also
Students lived out on the old Air Force Base?
yes,
I had never
they called
heard
it
that.
Vettsburg, and they had a bus service running from Vettsburg to the campus.
So they were going to school on the GI Bill and
Mhm.
living out there.
Hmm. And also where Strahan is now, Coliseum, there was student housing there. They called that Riverside Homes, and those were old barracks that were converted. They were moved in from somewhere, I'm sure, and they were converted into student housing. And my brother and sister-in-law lived in Riverside. My sister and brother-in-law lived at Vettsburg.
Now, did Ben have any brothers and sisters that lived here in San Marcos?
Ben had one sister, and she and her husband, they lived at Riverside Homes too for his first couple of years in college, and then he transferred to UT.
And Ben passed away when?
In 1992.
Okay.
Ben was a kidney dialysis patient for 11 years
Oh,
before
wow.
his death.
Music. What was the music? I know she's bad that she didn't dance, but
Music, like
yeah,
performances in San Marcos?
anything, any kind
What was popular back then? Music. Brenda's asking me. That was a hard question. We're gonna. Yeah, we can't ask about dancing. So, your daughter grew up here, and she still lives here. Did your daughter go to college here?
Yes. Yes, she.
What was the size of the college then?
I don't know.
It's grown.
It's grown.
It has grown so
it's
much.
grown.
Just hearing about the buildings on the square, not one thing is still there. That,
When I came to college, there was one girl who had a car. Her name was Babe Barnett, and she was from Brady. And she had a '47 Ford.
where
coupe.
did y'all go in that car?
Oh, I never went anywhere in that car.
Oh, she just had you couldn't sign yourself out and go riding in the car?
Well, I was never invited to go riding
Oh.
in the car.
So did you ride the bus to and from college, or did your mama bring you down here when you came?
My oldest brother and my oldest sister were both in San Marcos for my brother to go to school and for my sister and brother-in-law to go to school. They had all started to college before the war, and the war interrupted their college. So
all of y'all went to college here.
Well, we did.
Out of the 6, 4 of them went to college here?
Well, let's see. My half-sister got her first degree at Howard Payne, and then she got her master's degree here. And then the oldest child in our family got both of her degrees here. And her husband got his first, or maybe both of his degrees here. My oldest brother got his first degree here. Then 2 of my brothers, one of my half-brothers and 2 of my own brothers went to Baylor Law School. And my brother who is 3 years older than I am, neither he nor I completed college.
That was quite something that all of y'all went to college. Back then, lots of kids didn't go to college.
Especially women.
Yeah, especially
Girls,
your
yeah.
sister got 2 degrees. That's wonderful.
Well,
What was the biggest thing that has ever happened in San Marcos since she lived here?
Okay. What do you remember in all these years you lived here? What is the biggest thing that happened in San Marcos that you can remember?
what? Oh, filming The Getaway?
Oh, you got to meet
For that.
Steve McQueen and Ally McCraw when they filmed The Getaway here?
Well, I intended to meet them, but there was a restaurant out. Ed Tarbutton had a restaurant out on York's Creek named the Barn at York
Uh-huh.
Creek, and Ally McGraw and Steve McQueen were staying at an apartment complex close to our house, and I had thought, well, I'm going to ask them to come over and have the neighborhood kids come, you know. And one day I went to work and somebody said, "Did you hear what happened at the barn at York Creek last night?" Well, no. Well, they had to ask Steve McQueen and Ally McGraw to leave because they were acting so very inappropriately at a corner table.
Uh-oh.
So I thought, well, maybe the kids don't need to meet Steve and Ally. We had a customer who was an extra in that film, and her name was Jewel Box. And one day she came in the bank, and she was so exasperated, she said, "I tell you, I'm never going to work for Sam Peckinpah again."
Hollywood came to San Marcos. It
Yes.
wasn't pretty, huh?
Oh, and I tell you, there was the prettiest bank rose at Barker's Corner, which is now where Shipley's is.
Uh-huh.
Prettiest bank rose though that I ever saw growing there. And they had those blow up scenes,
The car ran off the road right there, and they took that rose bush out.
Well, some explosion took that rose bush out, and I regret it till yet.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you, Nova. That's been very interesting.
Thank you, Sue.